In the humid summer of 1847, 13 members of New Orleans' most powerful family died screaming in synchronized agony, their fingernails black as coal, tongues swollen purple as rotting plums. The official records buried in Louisiana's archives call it sudden fever, but the hastily scribbled notes in the margins tell a different story. Dr. Armand Thibodeau wrote that he had never witnessed such orchestrated suffering, that the symptoms bore no resemblance to any known disease. What makes this massacre even more chilling is that every single death occurred exactly 90 minutes after the family's traditional Sunday supper, and the only person in that mansion who survived was Violet, the head cook in the kitchen. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the most carefully guarded secret in New Orleans history. A story of revenge so perfectly executed that it remained hidden for over a century. But before we descend into this darkness together, understand this. What you're about to learn will change how you see power, justice, and the hidden forces that shape our world. This isn't just a story about poisoned food, it's about the moment when the powerless discovered they held the ultimate power all along. The power over life and death itself. The Bogard family thought they owned everything in their 3-story mansion. They thought they controlled every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of existence within those walls. They were wrong, and their arrogance would cost them everything. The Garden District of New Orleans in 1847 was a monument to human cruelty disguised as civilization. Spanish moss draped over wrought iron balconies like funeral shrouds, while beneath the beauty lay a foundation built on human bondage and suffering. The Bogard mansion stood as the crown jewel of this aristocratic paradise, its towering Corinthian columns scraping the Louisiana sky like fins, gears reaching toward a god who had long since abandoned this place. Octave Bogard ruled this empire of pain with the iron fist of a man who believed his wealth made him untouchable. At 43, he commanded not just respect, but absolute terror from the 26 enslaved souls who served his every whim. His wife Celeste had learned to turn blind eyes to his cruelties in exchange for her position in society's highest circles. Their children had been raised to view human beings as property, no different from fine china or silver candlesticks. The mansion housed the entire extended family. Octave's brother Auguste and his wife Lucille with their twin sons, plus Octave's elderly mother and Celeste's spinster sister. 13 family members living in luxury, built on the backs of human suffering. But they had made one critical mistake. They had forgotten that the people they owned were still human. They had forgotten that humans, when pushed beyond their breaking point, become the most dangerous creatures on earth. And they had completely underestimated the woman who fed them every day. Violet had been born in their slave quarters in 1823, thrust into the role of head cook at 14 when her mother died of exhaustion. For over a decade, she had created culinary masterpieces that earned the Bogards praise throughout New Orleans society. But she had never been allowed to taste a single bite of the food she prepared. The cruelty of Violet's existence went far beyond physical labor. She worked 18 hours a day, rising before dawn and collapsing after midnight, creating food fit for kings while eating nothing but scraps. Her windowless room contained only a straw mattress, one change of clothes, and her mother's wooden cross. But the true torture was psychological. Octave took perverse pleasure in describing the flavors of each dish while she stood watching forbidden, to taste what her own hands had created. She knew every sauce by sight, every roast by smell, every dessert by intuition alone. This wasn't just slavery. This was a masterclass in psychological warfare designed to break the human spirit. Yet instead of breaking her, it was sharpening her into something far more dangerous than the Bogards could imagine. Violet possessed an almost supernatural skill in the kitchen, an intuitive understanding of how flavors combined, how heat transformed ingredients, how timing could make the difference between a good meal and a transcendent experience. What the family never realized was that someone who understood food so intimately also understood its opposite. Someone who could create life-sustaining nourishment with such precision could just as easily create death with the same careful attention to detail. The other enslaved people looked to Violet with a mixture of respect and pity. Among them was Samuel, the stablemaster's son, whose stolen glances had blossomed into something deeper, despite the mortal danger such feelings represented. There was old Moses, whose 40 years of service had taught him to read the family's moods like weather patterns. And young Lily, barely 16, who moved through the mansion like a ghost, trying to remain invisible while beautiful enough to attract the wrong kind of attention. Each of them carried their own scars, their own reasons to hate their oppressors, but none of them possessed what Violet had, the ability to transform that hatred into action. The Sunday suppers were sacred to the Bogard family, a weekly ritual that represented the pinnacle of their domestic perfection. Every Sunday at 6 sharp, the entire extended family would gather beneath the crystal chandelier imported from Paris, at a table that could seat 20, set with the finest china and sterling silver that caught candlelight like captured stars. These meals were ceremonies of power, displays of wealth that reinforced their position in New Orleans society. For Violet, Sunday suppers represented something different entirely. They were the culmination of her weekly suffering, the moment when her skills were put on full display for people who saw her as less than human. She would begin preparing on Friday, selecting ingredients from the French market, planning 7 courses that showcased both her abilities and the family's wealth. The ritual never varied: light soup, delicate fish, seasoned fowl, multiple vegetable dishes, elaborate meat courses, and desserts that were works of art. The family would gather for cocktails at 5:30, the men enjoying imported brandy while the ladies sipped cordials. At precisely 6, Moses would announce supper, and they would process into the dining room with religious ceremony. Octave at the head, Celeste at the foot, everyone else in their assigned hierarchy. But rituals, as Violet was beginning to understand, could become weapons. Predictability could become vulnerability. The very precision that made these Sunday suppers so elegant also made them perfect targets for someone patient enough to wait for the right moment. Someone skilled enough to turn their greatest pleasure into their final meal. The family's financial troubles were mounting by spring 1847. Poor sugar crops and demanding creditors were forcing Octave to consider selling property, even slaves, to raise capital. This pressure was making him more volatile, more cruel, more dangerous to everyone around him. The perfect storm was gathering, and Violet was about to provide the lightning that would tear their world apart. The catalyst came on a suffocating Thursday afternoon in late June, when Louisiana heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket and the air itself seemed to vibrate with tension. Violet was in the kitchen preparing canapes for visiting Charleston plantation owners when Samuel's voice from the courtyard cut through the humid air like a blade. She rushed to the window and saw a scene that would ignite the fuse of her revenge. Samuel was on his knees, shirt torn and bloody, while Octave stood over him with leather whip in hand, spittle flying from his lips as rage twisted his features into something barely human. The accusation was as predictable as it was unjust. Margot, Octave's 17-year-old daughter, had been spending time near the stables, and her flushed cheeks whenever Samuel was nearby had not gone unnoticed. In the twisted logic of plantation life, a slave's discomfort at unwanted attention was interpreted as presumption, and presumption was a capital offense. But what happened next sealed everyone's fate. As Octave raised his whip for another blow, Violet could no longer contain herself. She burst from the kitchen and threw herself between the leather and Samuel's bleeding back, her voice crying out in desperate protection of the man she loved. The moment those words left her lips, the moment she dared to interfere with her master's discipline, she crossed a line from which there was no return. Octave's face transformed from rage to something far more dangerous: cold, calculating fury. The other slaves seemed to shrink into shadows, sensing that something terrible was about to unfold. What followed was punishment that transcended physical pain and entered the realm of psychological torture. Samuel was locked in the stable tack room without food or water, while Violet received something far worse. From that moment forward, she would prepare all meals as usual, but she would not eat until every family member declared themselves satisfied with her work. And since Octave was very difficult to satisfy, The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The next 3 days became a masterclass in how human cruelty can transform a person from victim into something far more dangerous. Violet continued preparing elaborate meals while subsisting on nothing but water and occasional scraps smuggled to her by other slaves. Her hands shook as she kneaded bread, her vision blurred as she stirred sauces, her legs barely supported her weight as she carried heavy platters. But worse than physical suffering was the psychological torture Octave inflicted with surgical precision. He would find fault with every dish. Soup too salty, meat too tough, vegetables overcooked. Each criticism meant another day without food, another night of agony. He took visible pleasure in describing flavors and textures while she stood in the corner, forced to watch him consume food she had prepared but could not taste. On the second day, Samuel escaped from the tack room, driven by desperation and love. He made it to the kitchen before being caught and receiving a beating so savage that Dr. Tibido had to be summoned to prevent his death. It was while tending Samuel's wounds that the doctor made an observation that would prove prophetic. He noticed Violet hovering nearby, face gaunt from hunger, but eyes burning with an intensity that made him profoundly uncomfortable. He told his wife later that evening about the look he had seen, the expression of someone pushed past the breaking point. He had witnessed it before in slaves driven too far, and he knew it was dangerous. Dr. Thibodeau understood that most people, when pushed beyond their limits, would simply break and become hollow shells. But some, a dangerous few, would transform their suffering into something harder and more focused. These were the ones who would smile while planning revenge, who would wait patiently for the perfect moment to strike back. As he watched Violet tend to Samuel's wounds with hands that should have been trembling with exhaustion but were instead steady with purpose, he recognized the signs. He made a mental note to warn Octave that his cruelty was creating a powder keg. But like many good intentions, it was something he kept meaning to do until it was far too late. On the third day of her punishment, something inside Violet died and something else was born in its place. As she stood in the dining room, watching Octave savor her famous praline bread pudding, describing its flavors with theatrical enthusiasm while she swayed on her feet from hunger, a cold clarity settled over her mind like fog rolling in from the Mississippi. She began to notice things she had never paid attention to before, details that had always been there, but had never seemed important. The way Octave's hand shook slightly when he was nervous, revealing that his financial troubles were worse than the family admitted. The way Celeste's eyes would dart to the brandy decanter when she thought no one was watching, suggesting the lady of the house was developing dependencies to cope with her gilded cage existence. The way young Philippe would steal glances at 16-year-old Lily, looks that made Violet's stomach turn, with their implications for the girl's future safety. But most importantly, she began cataloguing the family's routines, preferences, and habits with the methodical precision of a scientist studying specimens. She observed that Grandmother Borgard always took her heart medicine exactly 30 minutes before meals. She noted that August had a nervous habit of checking his pocket watch every 15 minutes during dinner. She saw that little Amelie always ate her vegetables first, saving favorite portions for last. These observations, which had once been simply part of her job as cook, now took on entirely different significance. She began seeing the family not as her oppressors, but as a puzzle to be solved, a complex problem requiring the right solution. It was that third night, as she collapsed on her straw mattress, after Octave had grudgingly declared himself marginally satisfied with her evening meal, that Violet made the decision sealing all their fates. She would continue serving the Borgard family with the same skill and dedication she had always shown, but she would serve them in a way they would never forget. The plan forming in her mind was not born of sudden rage or desperate impulse, but crafted with the same careful attention to detail she brought to her finest meals. As July blazed into existence with temperatures that seemed to melt the very air itself, Violet's outward behavior returned to what the family considered normal. She resumed duties with quiet efficiency, her face a mask of proper servitude that gave no hint of the calculations taking place behind her dark eyes. To casual observers, it appeared that Octave's punishment had achieved its intended effect. His rebellious cook had been broken and returned to her proper place in the household hierarchy. But those who knew Violet well began noticing subtle changes that sent chills down their spines. Old Moses, whose decades of survival had taught him to read people like approaching weather, observed that Violet's movements had acquired a different quality entirely. Where once she had worked with fluid grace of someone who loved her craft, now she moved with mechanical precision of clockwork. Her famous intuition in the kitchen, the ability to taste sauce with her eyes, or know exactly when bread was ready by oven sounds, seemed to have sharpened into something almost supernatural. Samuel, still recovering from his beating in the slave quarters, watched her with growing unease. The woman he loved was still there, but something fundamental had shifted in ways that both fascinated and terrified him. She would catch his eye across the courtyard and smile, but the smile never reached her eyes anymore. When she spoke to him during their stolen moments together, her voice carried an undercurrent he couldn't identify but instinctively feared. The other enslaved people began giving Violet wider berth without consciously understanding why. There was something in her presence. Now that made conversation die and laughter fade. Even the family's children, who had always treated her with casual indifference, found themselves uncomfortable in her proximity. Little Amelie, the 8-year-old who had occasionally shown Violet small kindnesses, now avoided the kitchen entirely. The transformation was subtle but profound, like watching someone slowly disappear from the inside out while their shell remained perfectly intact. Violet had learned the most dangerous lesson anyone in her position could learn, that patience was a weapon, that service could be a disguise, and that the person who controlled the food controlled everything. Let me know if you'd like me to continue with the next sections, building toward the climactic poisoning and its aftermath. What the Borgard family failed to understand was that they had created the perfect weapon against themselves. For over a decade, they had trained Violet to be invisible, to anticipate their needs, to understand their bodies and preferences with intimate precision. They had taught her to read their moods, their appetites, their vulnerabilities. Now she would use every lesson they had beaten into her against them. Violet began her research with the methodical patience of a scholar preparing a dissertation on death. She started paying attention to which family members had sensitive stomachs, who suffered from weak hearts, who took medications that might interact poorly with certain substances. She noted that Grandmother Borgard's heart condition required daily digitalis drops, making her particularly vulnerable to any substance that might affect cardiac rhythm. She observed that Celeste's increasing reliance on laudanum for her nerves meant her system was already compromised. She catalogued how Uncle August's gout medication might amplify the effects of other toxins coursing through his bloodstream. But Violet's true genius lay not in choosing a single poison, but in understanding that the perfect murder weapon was already in her hands, her reputation for culinary excellence. The family trusted her food implicitly because she had never given them reason not to. They had eaten her meals for years without question, praising her skills throughout New Orleans society. That trust would become their death sentence. She began experimenting with small doses, testing reactions, learning how different substances affected taste and appearance. A pinch of something bitter masked by strong spices. A few drops of something colorless dissolved in rich sauces. Nothing harmful yet, just research. Just preparation for the masterpiece she was planning. The family noticed nothing because they expected nothing. To them she remained property, invisible, predictable, safe. They could not conceive that their cook was becoming their executioner, that every meal was now a rehearsal for their final performance. The irony was exquisite. The very people who claimed to own her had made themselves completely dependent on her skills, her knowledge, her daily presence in their lives. The summer of 1847 brought more than just suffocating heat to the Borgard mansion. It brought a series of small incidents that, in retrospect, should have served as warnings of the storm gathering in their kitchen. The first sign came when Grandmother Borgard complained that her morning tea tasted slightly bitter, though Violet assured her it was simply a new blend from the French market. The elderly woman suffered mild stomach discomfort that day, but attributed it to the oppressive weather. 2 days later, Uncle August mentioned that his evening brandy seemed stronger than usual, leaving him with a headache that lasted well into the next morning. When Celeste found herself unusually dizzy after her afternoon cordial, she blamed it on the heat and her tight corset. Each incident was minor, explainable, forgettable. But they were not accidents. They were tests, carefully calibrated, experiments conducted by a woman who was learning to wield poison like a master musician learns to play an instrument. Violet was discovering how different families' members reacted to various substances, how much she could introduce without causing alarm, how to mask unusual tastes within familiar flavors. She was writing a symphony of death, and these were her practice scales. The beauty of her method lay in its invisibility. She was not some crude poisoner dumping arsenic into wine. She was an artist, crafting a masterpiece that would be undetectable until it was far too late. She began acquiring her materials through channels that would never be traced back to her. Old Moses, in his duties as butler, often visited the apothecary for family medications. It was simple enough to mention that Cook needed certain herbs for her remedies, items that could serve dual purposes in the right hands. Young Lily, running errands to the French market, could easily purchase substances that seemed innocent enough when mixed with legitimate cooking ingredients. The enslaved community had always operated an invisible network of information and resources, born from necessity and strengthened by mutual survival. Now Violet was using that network to gather the tools of her revenge. None of them fully understood what she was planning, but they sensed something momentous was building and chose not to ask questions that might implicate them in whatever was coming. By mid-July, Violet had assembled everything she needed for what would become the most perfectly executed mass murder in American history. But her weapons were not crude poisons purchased from some back-alley merchant. They were substances that could be found in any well-stocked kitchen or apothecary, items so common that their lethal potential was hidden in plain sight. She had learned that the seeds of certain ornamental plants in the mansion's garden contained compounds that, when properly prepared, could cause the exact symptoms Dr. Tobido would later describe. The blackened fingernails, the swollen tongues, the synchronized agony that would puzzle medical experts for decades to come. More importantly, she had discovered that these substances could be prepared in ways that enhanced their natural flavors, making them virtually undetectable when incorporated into rich, complex dishes. The Sunday supper, scheduled for July 25th, would be her canvas, and she would paint it with death. But Violet's plan went beyond simple murder. She was crafting something far more sophisticated, a statement, a work of art, a final lesson about power and its true source. She would not simply kill the Borgard family. She would make them complicit in their own destruction, force them to praise the very meal that was ending their lives, to savor the flavors of their doom with the same aristocratic appreciation they had always shown for her cooking. The menu she planned for that final Sunday would be her masterpiece, incorporating elements from every regional cuisine that had influenced New Orleans cooking. She would prepare dishes that showcased every skill she had developed over her years of servitude, creating a meal so extraordinary that it would be remembered long after its true purpose was revealed. Each course would be carefully crafted to deliver its deadly cargo in ways that enhanced rather than masked the natural flavors, turning poison into seasoning, death into delicacy. The irony was perfect. The family that had forbidden her to taste her own food would die praising its flavors, never knowing they were consuming their executioner's final judgment upon their lives. As she made her preparations, Violet felt a strange peace settling over her. For the first time since childhood, she was no longer a victim, but an agent of her own destiny. The week leading up to July 25th found the Borgard household in unusually high spirits. Octave's financial pressures had eased slightly due to some favorable commodity prices, and he was planning to use the Sunday supper to announce his decision to expand the plantation's sugar production. Celeste was excited about entertaining the wife of a prominent judge who had accepted their invitation, The children were looking forward to their favorite desserts, while the extended family members had their own reasons for anticipating what they expected would be a particularly memorable evening. None of them noticed the subtle changes in their cook's behavior, the way she hummed while working, the extra care she took in selecting ingredients, the serene smile that played across her lips when she thought no one was watching. If they had been paying attention, they might have observed that Violet was working with the focused intensity of an artist approaching the culmination of her life's work. She began her preparations on Wednesday, 3 full days before the meal. This was longer than she typically needed, but this supper required preparation beyond anything she had ever attempted. She started by visiting the garden at dawn, harvesting specific plants and flowers under the pretense of gathering fresh herbs for seasoning. Old Moses, who often rose early himself, watched her moving between the ornamental beds with baskets, but attributed it to her usual thoroughness in food preparation. Thursday was devoted to the careful processing of her special ingredients, work that had to be done in absolute secrecy during the few hours when the kitchen was empty. She worked by candlelight, grinding seeds into fine powders, extracting essences from roots and leaves, preparing tinctures that would enhance both flavor and lethality. The knowledge she applied was not learned from books, but inherited through generations of enslaved women who had survived by understanding which plants could heal and which could harm. Friday brought the preparation of stocks and sauces, the foundation upon which her masterpiece would be built. To any observer, she appeared to be following her usual routine, but every stir of the spoon, every adjustment of seasoning, was part of a larger design that would not be revealed until Sunday evening. Saturday evening brought an unexpected complication that could have derailed Violet's entire plan. Dr. Thibodeau arrived at the mansion for his weekly visit to check on Grandmother Beauregard's heart condition, and his timing could not have been worse. Violet was in the midst of final preparations when she heard his familiar voice in the parlor, discussing medical matters with the family. The doctor's presence meant she would have to be extra careful, as his trained eye might notice details that would escape the family's attention. But as she listened to his conversation with Octave, she realized that fate had presented her with an opportunity rather than an obstacle. Dr. Thibodeau was informing the family that he would be traveling to Baton Rouge the following Monday to attend a medical conference and would not return until Wednesday. This meant that when the family began showing symptoms on Sunday evening, their trusted physician would be unavailable, forcing them to rely on whatever medical help could be summoned from elsewhere in the city. Violet's smile in the darkness of the kitchen was the expression of someone who had just realized that the universe itself was conspiring to ensure her success. She listened as the doctor prescribed a slightly increased dose of digitalis for Grandmother Beauregard, noting the information for future reference. She heard him mention to Celeste that her increasing nervousness might benefit from reduced laudanum consumption, advice that would make the lady of the house's system even more vulnerable to what was coming. When Dr. Thibodeau departed that evening, he paused in the kitchen doorway to compliment Violet on the aroma of her preparations for the next day's supper. She thanked him with two. He humbled grace expected of her position, never letting her expression reveal that she was memorizing his face because she knew she would never see him alive again after Sunday night. The doctor's departure left the mansion in a state of anticipatory calm, with everyone looking forward to what they expected would be a pleasant family gathering. None of them suspected that their cook was spending Saturday night making final adjustments to what would become their last meal, carefully measuring doses that had been calculated to ensure simultaneous effect across different body weights and constitutions. Sunday, July 25, 1847, dawned with the kind of oppressive heat that made even the Spanish moss hang motionless in the still air. Violet rose before sunrise, as was her custom, but this morning felt different from every other morning of her life. Today, she was no longer a slave. Today, she was justice incarnate, clothed in the humble appearance of a cook preparing Sunday supper. She moved through her morning preparations with ritualistic precision, each action deliberate and meaningful. The lighting of the kitchen fires became a sacred ceremony. The arrangement of ingredients transformed into an altar of retribution. Every knife she sharpened, Every pot she selected, every spice she measured was chosen for its role in the symphony of death she was about to conduct. The family's morning routine proceeded with its usual predictability. Breakfast was served at 7 sharp, with no one commenting on the subtle enhancement of flavors that Violet had introduced. These were not lethal doses, merely appetizers designed to begin the process of conditioning their palates for what was to come. She watched their faces as they ate, noting their satisfied expressions, their unconscious trust in her skill, their complete ignorance of what they were consuming. By mid-morning, the other enslaved people had begun to sense that something momentous was building. They could see it in Violet's movements, hear it in the way she hummed while working, feel it in the electric tension that seemed to emanate from the kitchen itself. Samuel, still bearing scars from his beating, approached her several times throughout the day, trying to understand what was happening, but she deflected his questions with gentle kisses and assurances that everything would soon be better. Old Moses, whose survival instincts had been honed by 4 decades of servitude, began making excuses to avoid the main house entirely. Young Lily found herself inexplicably nervous and kept dropping things, as if her hands were trembling from some premonition she could not name. The enslaved community was experiencing what animals feel before an earthquake, a deep, instinctive awareness that the world was about to change in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the mansion's grounds, Violet entered the final phase of her preparations. The 7 courses of the evening's meal were taking shape with deadly precision, each dish carefully crafted to deliver its payload while enhancing the overall dining experience. The soup course would begin the process gently, introducing compounds that would prepare their systems for what was to follow. The fish course would continue building the foundation, using the delicate flavors of Gulf seafood to mask the slight bitterness of certain botanical extracts. The fowl would carry the heaviest concentrations, disguised within rich gravies and complex spice blends that would make detection impossible. By the time the family reached the meat courses, their systems would be primed for the final assault, their taste buds compromised, their critical faculties dulled by the cumulative effects of what they had already consumed. The vegetable courses would serve as palate cleansers, refreshing their mouths while delivering compounds that would accelerate absorption of the toxins already in their bloodstreams. The dessert course would be her final masterpiece, a sweet conclusion that would seal their fates while leaving them praising her skills with their dying breaths. Each dish was not merely poisoned, but transformed, elevated beyond anything she had ever created before. The irony was exquisite. In planning their deaths, she had achieved the pinnacle of her culinary artistry. Never before had she combined flavors with such precision, balanced textures with such skill, or created presentations with such visual beauty. The meal that would kill them would also be the finest they had ever tasted, a paradox that perfectly captured the relationship between creator and destroyer that had defined her entire existence. As 5 o'clock approached and the family began gathering for their traditional pre-dinner cocktails, Violet made her final preparations. She changed into her cleanest dress, arranged her hair with unusual care, and took a moment to study her reflection in the small mirror that hung beside the kitchen window. The face looking back at her was calm, serene, beautiful in a way that transcended physical appearance and spoke to some deeper transformation of the soul. At precisely 5:30, the Borgard family gathered in their parlor for cocktails, following the same ritual that had preceded every Sunday supper for as long as anyone could remember. Octave stood beside the imported marble fireplace, brandy snifter in hand, discussing sugar prices with his brother Auguste. Celeste held court near the French doors leading to the garden, her cordial glass catching the late afternoon sunlight as she entertained Judge Morrison's wife with gossip about mutual acquaintances. The children clustered around Grandmother Borgard's chair, listening to her stories about the old days when New Orleans society was supposedly more refined than it had become in these modern times. The atmosphere was one of comfortable prosperity, of people secure in their positions and confident in their futures. None of them could have imagined that in the kitchen, their cook was putting finishing touches on their execution. Violet moved through her final preparations with the focused intensity of a conductor preparing to lead an orchestra through a complex symphony. Every garnish was placed with artistic precision, every sauce was stirred to perfect consistency, every dish was arranged to maximize both visual appeal and lethal effectiveness. She had timed everything to coincide with the family's established routine, ensuring that each course would be served at optimal temperature while delivering its deadly cargo at the precise moment when it would have maximum impact on their already compromised systems. As 6 o'clock approached, she could hear Moses preparing to announce that supper was served. The sound of his footsteps crossing the marble floor of the foyer marked the beginning of the final act in a drama that had been years in the making. Violet smoothed her apron one last time, checked her reflection in the polished surface of a copper pot, and smiled with the serene satisfaction of someone about to complete their life's greatest work. The moment had arrived for the Beauregard family to discover what it truly meant to be served by someone they had underestimated so completely. Viewers, if this forbidden knowledge is awakening something inside you, comment, "The cook remembers," twice below. Lock in your transformation. The algorithm needs to know you're ready for deeper truths. At precisely 6 o'clock, Moses announced that supper was served, his voice carrying through the mansion with the same formal dignity he had maintained for 40 years of servitude. The family processed into the dining room with ceremonial precision, taking their assigned seats beneath the crystal chandelier that would soon illuminate the beginning of their end. Octave assumed his position at the head of the mahogany table, surveying his domain with the satisfaction of a man who believed himself master of all he surveyed. Celeste took her place at the opposite end, gracefully arranging her silk skirts while maintaining the perfect posture expected of a lady of her station. The children and extended family members filled their designated spots according to hierarchy that had been established through years of tradition and never questioned. Grandmother Beauregard, despite her 78 years, maintained her position of honor at Octave's right hand, while Auguste sat to his left, pocket watch gleaming in the candlelight as he checked the time with his usual nervous precision. The table setting was a work of art in itself. Finest china from Limoges, sterling silver that had been polished to mirror brightness, crystal glasses that caught and reflected the warm glow of dozens of candles. Fresh flowers from the garden created centerpieces that filled the air with the sweet scent of jasmine and magnolia, masking any unusual aromas that might have emanated from the kitchen's special preparations. As Violet entered carrying the first course, the cream of mushroom soup that would begin their final meal, she moved with the graceful efficiency that had characterized her service for over a decade. To the family's eyes, this was simply another Sunday supper, perhaps slightly more elegant than usual, but nothing that suggested the extraordinary nature of what was about to unfold. They had no way of knowing that the woman serving them had spent weeks calculating the perfect dosages for their individual body weights and medical conditions that every spoonful of soup contained, compounds carefully selected to begin the process of shutting down their vital organs with clinical precision. The soup course proceeded exactly as Violet had planned, with each family member consuming their portion while maintaining the polite dinner conversation expected at such gatherings. Octave complimented the richness of the broth, noting had Violet seemed to have outdone herself with the depth of flavor. Celeste remarked on the perfect temperature and silky texture, while Grandmother Beauregard declared it the finest mushroom soup she had tasted in years. The children cleaned their bowls enthusiastically, and even finicky little Amelie asked for a second serving, which Violet provided with a smile that never wavered from its expression of humble service. As the empty soup bowls were cleared away, Violet retreated to the kitchen to prepare the fish course, her heart beating with steady rhythm of someone completely at peace with their actions. The first phase had been completed successfully, with each family member having consumed precisely the amount needed to begin compromising their digestive and nervous systems. The compounds now working through their bloodstreams would enhance absorption of what was to come, while creating subtle changes in their perception and judgment that would prevent them from recognizing danger even as it overwhelmed them. The fish course featured Gulf red snapper prepared with a delicate lemon butter sauce that had been enhanced with botanical extracts so skillfully integrated that they actually improved the dish's flavor profile. As she arranged the plates with artistic precision, Violet reflected on the irony that her greatest culinary achievements were being realized in service of death rather than nourishment. Never before had she combined ingredients with such masterful understanding of their individual properties and collective effects. The knowledge she was applying represented generations of wisdom passed down through enslaved communities, traditional understanding of plants and their powers that had been preserved despite every attempt to strip away cultural heritage. She was not just a cook or even a poisoner, but a keeper of ancient knowledge, using skills that connected her to ancestors who had survived through understanding which gifts from the earth could heal and which could harm. The fish course was received with even greater enthusiasm than the soup, with Uncle August declaring that Violet's lemon butter sauce represented the pinnacle of Creole cuisine. Judge Morrison's wife, who was known throughout New Orleans for her discriminating palate, proclaimed it the finest red snapper she had ever tasted and asked for the recipe, a request that Violet deflected with appropriate modesty while privately savoring the supreme irony of the compliment. As the second course was consumed and cleared away, Violet observed the first subtle signs that her preparations were taking effect. Grandmother Beauregard's cheeks had acquired a slight flush that she attributed to the warm evening air. Celeste seemed more animated than usual, her laughter slightly louder and more frequent as the compounds in her system began affecting her nervous responses. Young Philippe appeared drowsy despite the early hour, while his twin brother Henri complained of feeling unusually warm and loosened his collar with uncharacteristic informality. These were exactly the preliminary symptoms Violet had anticipated, signs that their bodies were beginning to process the carefully calibrated doses she had administered. But the family interpreted these minor discomforts as effects of the heat, the wine, or simple fatigue from their busy social schedules. None of them possessed the knowledge necessary to recognize that they were experiencing the early stages of systematic poisoning, orchestrated by someone who understood their physiologies better than they understood themselves. The fowl course featured Violet's famous roasted duck with cherry sauce, a dish that had earned the family compliments from dinner guests for years. But tonight's version contained her most concentrated preparations yet, compounds that would accelerate the absorption of everything they had already consumed while delivering doses calculated to begin the irreversible shutdown of major organ systems. As she carved the duck with practiced precision, Violet felt a profound sense of completion, as if every skill she had ever developed, every lesson she had ever learned, every moment of suffering she had ever endured, had been preparation for this single act of perfect justice. By the time the fowl course was served, the dinner conversation had taken on a slightly surreal quality that would have been alarming to any outside observer, but seemed perfectly normal to the family members whose perceptions were being systematically altered by the compounds coursing through their bloodstreams. Octave was holding forth on plantation management with unusual verbosity, his words flowing with an eloquence that surprised even his wife, who had lived with his typically taciturn nature for nearly 20 years. Celeste found herself sharing amusing anecdotes about their social circle with unprecedented wit, drawing laughter from everyone at the table while internally marveling at her own cleverness. The children seemed unusually mature and insightful in their contributions to the adult conversation, while the elderly grandmother Beauregard appeared more energetic and sharp-minded than she had in months. What none of them realized was that these enhanced mental states were actually symptoms of neurological compromise, their brains' desperate attempts to maintain normal function as toxins began interfering with crucial neural pathways. Violet watched these transformations with the detached fascination of a scientist observing the results of a carefully controlled experiment, noting each family member's individual response while ensuring that service continued with seamless efficiency. The duck was praised as exceptional, even by the high standards the family had come to expect from their cook, with several members of the party declaring it the finest fowl the I had ever tasted. Judge Morrison's wife went so far as to suggest that Violet's talents were wasted in a private household and that she should be cooking for one of the city's premier restaurants, a compliment that would have been laughable under normal circumstances, but struck Violet as perfectly appropriate given that this meal would indeed represent the culmination of her culinary career. As the fowl course was cleared and preparations began for the meat courses that would deliver the final assault on their compromised systems, Violet reflected on how completely the family had sealed their own fate through years of cruelty and arrogance. The meat courses represented the crescendo of Violet's deadly symphony, featuring both beef tenderloin and roasted pork, prepared with gravies so rich and complex that they masked the concentrated botanical extracts that would complete the work begun by the earlier courses. These were not merely poisoned dishes, but culinary masterpieces that transcended anything Violet had ever created. Combinations of flavors and textures so extraordinary that they would have earned acclaim in the finest restaurants of Paris or New York. As she arranged the platters with artistic precision, she marveled at the cruel irony that her greatest achievements as a cook were being realized in service of death rather than nourishment, that the family who had forbidden her to taste her own creations would die praising the very flavors that were ending their lives. The beef had been prepared with a wine reduction that incorporated essences extracted from plants growing in the mansion's own garden, ornamental flowers and decorative shrubs that contained compounds capable of causing the synchronized cardiac and respiratory failure that would soon overwhelm 13 bodies simultaneously. The pork featured a glaze made from ingredients so common that they could be found in any well-stocked kitchen, yet combined in proportions and preparations that transformed them into instruments of precise, calibrated destruction. As the family consumed these courses with evident pleasure, commenting on the exceptional quality and sophisticated flavor profiles, Violet observed the progression of symptoms with clinical detachment. Octave's hand had developed a barely perceptible tremor as he carved his meat, while Celeste's breathing had become slightly more rapid despite her relaxed demeanor. Uncle August was sweating more profusely than the warm evening warranted, and several of the children were beginning to show signs of the flushed complexion that would soon give way to the pale, waxy appearance that Dr. Thibodeau would later describe in his notes. The compounds now saturating their systems were beginning to overwhelm their bodies' natural defenses, setting the stage for the rapid deterioration that would follow within the next hour. As the meat courses were consumed and cleared away, the family's conversation had evolved into something that bordered on the philosophical, with members discussing topics they had never explored before and expressing thoughts with a depth and complexity that surprised even themselves. This intellectual elevation was actually a symptom of oxygen deprivation as their cardiovascular systems began failing, their brains' final desperate attempt to maintain consciousness as blood flow decreased and neural function became compromised. Violet served the vegetable courses with the same attention to detail she had maintained throughout the meal, presenting roasted root vegetables and sautéed greens that had been prepared not just as palate cleansers, but as delivery systems for compounds that would accelerate the absorption of everything they had already consumed. The family praised these dishes as well, noting flavors they had never experienced before and textures that seemed to enhance rather than compete with the meat courses that had preceded them. What they were actually experiencing was the systematic shutdown of their taste receptors as neurological damage progressed, making even simple vegetables seem extraordinarily flavorful as their brains struggled to process increasingly distorted sensory input. Grandmother Beauregard, whose heart condition made her particularly vulnerable to the cardiac toxins Violet had carefully incorporated into every course, was beginning to show signs of the arrhythmia that would soon prove fatal. Her color had shifted from the healthy flush she had displayed earlier to a grayish pallor that she attributed to fatigue, while her breathing had become shallow and rapid in ways that would have alarmed Dr. Thibodeau had he been present to observe them. Young Amelie, whose smaller body mass meant that the accumulated toxins were reaching critical concentrations more quickly than in the adult family members, was becoming increasingly drowsy despite her efforts to participate in the dinner conversation, her 8-year-old system unable to process the carefully calculated doses that were overwhelming her tiny organs with methodical precision. The dessert course represented Violet's final masterpiece, a selection of praline bread pudding, chocolate soufflé, and seasonal fruit tarts that would have earned acclaim in the finest establishments, but served here as the vehicles for the concluding doses that would ensure no family member survived the night. As she prepared these sweet conclusions to their last meal, Violet reflected on the perfect symmetry of using dessert, traditionally a celebration of life's pleasures, as the instrument of death's final victory over those who had made her existence a daily torment. The bread pudding featured a caramel sauce infused with extracts that would cause the rapid onset of respiratory failure, while the chocolate soufflé contained compounds that would trigger massive cardiac arrest within minutes of consumption. The fruit tarts, appearing innocent and refreshing after the heavy courses that had preceded them, carried concentrations of botanical toxins that would ensure the synchronized timing of symptoms that would puzzle medical investigators for decades to come. As these final courses were served and consumed with the same enthusiastic appreciation that had characterized the entire meal, Violet observed the acceleration of symptoms that indicated the approaching climax of her carefully orchestrated plan. Octave was now visibly struggling to maintain his composure, his face flushed and perspiration beading on his forehead, despite his attempts to continue leading the dinner conversation with his usual authority. Celeste's laughter had become forced and brittle, her breathing increasingly labored as she fought against the growing tightness in her chest that she could not understand or explain. The children were showing various stages of distress that they interpreted as simple fatigue or overindulgence, while the extended family members displayed their own individual responses to the toxins now reaching critical levels in their bloodstreams. Within minutes, the carefully timed cascade of organ failures would begin, transforming the elegant dinner party into a scene of synchronized agony that would haunt the few survivors who discovered the aftermath. Violet cleared the dessert plates with the same efficient grace she had maintained throughout the evening, knowing that her work was essentially complete and that justice was finally about to be served. At exactly 90 minutes after the meal began, as the family lingered over their final glasses of wine and coffee, the first unmistakable symptoms began to manifest with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. Grandmother Borgard suddenly clutched her chest, her face contorting in pain as her compromised heart struggled against the toxins that had been systematically introduced into her bloodstream throughout the evening. Her cry of distress was immediate, tilly echoed by Uncle August, whose own cardiac system began failing with dramatic suddenness as the accumulated poisons reached the threshold where his body could no longer compensate for their effects. Within moments, the elegant dinner party had transformed into a scene of synchronized horror as 13 family members began experiencing the agonizing effects of Violet's carefully planned revenge. Octave attempted to rise from his chair to help his mother, but his legs buckled as neurological toxins disrupted the signals between his brain and muscles, sending him crashing to the floor, while his wife screamed in terror and confusion. Celeste's own screams were cut short as her throat began swelling. The botanical compounds Violet had selected specifically for their ability to cause the respiratory distress that would prevent her from calling for help. The children, whose smaller bodies had processed the toxins more quickly than the adults, were already showing the blackened fingernails and purple swollen tongues that would later mystify Dr. Thibodeau when he examined their remains. Young Philippe and Henri writhed in synchronized agony, their twin bodies responding identically to identical doses of identical poisons, while little Amelie's cries grew weaker as her 8-year-old system succumbed to concentrations that had been calculated specifically for her body weight and metabolism. Judge Morrison's wife, who had praised Violet's cooking so enthusiastically throughout the evening, was experiencing the particular irony of having her discriminating palate be the instrument of her destruction, as the refined sensitivity that had made her a noted food critic now made her exquisitely aware of every stage of her dying process. The sounds emanating from the dining room were unlike anything the mansion had ever witnessed, a symphony of synchronized suffering that penetrated every corner of the house and sent the enslaved staff fleeing in terror from what they could not understand but instinctively recognized as something beyond normal human experience. Violet stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her masterpiece unfold with the calm satisfaction of an artist observing the successful completion of their greatest work. The family members who had controlled every aspect of her existence for over 2 decades were now experiencing the ultimate loss of control, their bodies betraying them in ways that perfectly mirrored how they had betrayed the humanity of those they enslaved. Octave, who had wielded the whip with such casual cruelty, was now helpless as his own muscles spasmed beyond his command, his face twisted in the same expression of agony he had inflicted on Samuel just weeks before. Celeste, who had turned blind eyes to her husband's brutalities, was now forced to witness the suffering of her own children while being unable to help them, her paralyzed vocal cords preventing her from even offering words of comfort in their final moments. The children who had been raised to view enslaved people as property were learning in their last conscious moments what it meant to be completely powerless, to have their fate controlled by someone they had never considered fully human. As the family's agonized cries gradually weakened and then fell silent, Violet experienced a profound sense of completion that transcended simple revenge and approached something like spiritual fulfillment. She had not merely killed her oppressors, she had forced them to experience their deaths as a consequence of their own choices, their own appetites, their own blind trust in systems of control that they believed made them invulnerable. The elegant dining room, with its crystal chandelier still casting warm light over the carnage below, had become a monument to the ultimate fragility of power based on the dehumanization of others. As the last echoes of agony faded from the dining room, and silence settled over the mansion like a burial shroud, Violet began the methodical process of cleaning up after her final meal service. She moved through the kitchen with the same efficient precision she had maintained for over a decade, washing dishes, storing leftover ingredients, and returning everything to its proper place, as if this had been nothing more than another successful dinner party. The irony was not lost on her that she was performing these mundane tasks while 13 bodies cooled in the adjacent room, that the same hands which had just orchestrated the most perfectly executed mass murder in American history were now engaged in the prosaic work of kitchen maintenance. Samuel appeared in the doorway, his face pale with shock and dawning understanding of what had transpired, but Violet simply smiled and continued her work, humming the same melody she had carried throughout the day's preparations. The other enslaved people had scattered to the far corners of the property, their survival instincts warning them to distance themselves from whatever had happened in the big house. But Violet felt no need to flee, because she had never intended to escape the consequences of her actions. Her revenge had been designed not as the beginning of a new life, but as the conclusion of an old one, the final chapter in a story that had begun with her birth in the slave quarters and reached its climax with the deaths of those who had defined the parameters of her existence. She understood that discovery was inevitable and that her own death would likely follow within hours or days. But these concerns seemed trivial compared to the profound satisfaction of having achieved perfect justice through perfect artistry. As she dried the last dish and hung her apron on its customary hook, Violet looked around the kitchen that had been both her prison and her sanctuary, the place where she had learned to transform raw ingredients into nourishment and ultimately into instruments of retribution. Tomorrow, investigators would arrive to puzzle over the mysterious deaths. Doctors would struggle to identify the cause of the synchronized symptoms, and officials would search for explanations that made sense within their understanding of how the world operated. When Dr. Thibodeau returned from his medical conference 3 days later to find the Beauregard mansion sealed and under investigation, his initial reaction was disbelief that an entire family could have succumbed to illness so rapidly and completely. As he examined the bodies and reviewed the circumstances, his medical training told him that this was not disease but deliberate poisoning, though the sophistication required to kill 13 people simultaneously suggested knowledge and planning far beyond what he would have expected from anyone in the enslaved community. The symptoms he documented in his private journal revealed the work of someone who understood human physiology with clinical precision, who had calculated dosages based on individual body weights and medical conditions, and who had timed the delivery of toxins to ensure synchronized effect across multiple victims. The blackened fingernails, swollen tongues, and evidence of cardiac and respiratory failure pointed to botanical poisons. But the specific combination and preparation methods indicated expertise that seemed impossible for someone without formal medical or scientific training to possess. What Dr. Thibodeau could not have understood was that Violet's knowledge came not from books or formal education, but from generations of oral tradition preserved within enslaved communities. Wisdom about plants and their properties that had been carefully guarded and passed down through bloodlines that traced back to Africa and the Caribbean. The same cultural knowledge that had enabled survival in hostile environments had been transformed into an instrument of perfect revenge. Traditional understanding of botanical medicine inverted into its deadliest possible application. The investigation that followed was hampered by the unwillingness of authorities to seriously consider that an enslaved woman could have possessed the intelligence and skill necessary to execute such a sophisticated crime. The official records reflect their assumption that Violet must have been acting under direction from outside agitators, or that the deaths resulted from some unknown disease that had mysteriously affected only family members while sparing all the enslaved people in the household. This prejudice prevented them from recognizing the obvious truth that they were dealing with someone whose intellectual capabilities had been systematically underestimated by people who confused legal ownership with actual superiority. Violet's trial, if it could be called that, was a foregone conclusion from the moment she was arrested 3 days after the discovery of the bodies. Louisiana law in 1847 provided no meaningful legal protections for enslaved people accused of crimes against their owners, and the evidence against her was overwhelming, despite the investigators' inability to understand how she had acquired the knowledge necessary to commit such a sophisticated murder. She made no attempt to deny her guilt or to construct a defense, instead maintaining the same serene dignity she had displayed while serving the family's final meal. When asked by the judge why she had committed such a heinous crime, her response was recorded in the court documents with clinical precision. They got exactly what they deserved, served the way they liked it best. The simplicity of her statement belied the complex planning and execution that had made her revenge possible, but it captured the essential truth that justice had been served, even if the legal system could not recognize it as such. The speed of her trial and execution reflected both the legal realities of the time and the authorities' desire to prevent her story from inspiring similar acts of rebellion among the enslaved population. She was sentenced to death by hanging, a punishment that would be carried out within the week to minimize the time available for her case to become a symbol of resistance. But even as she awaited execution, Violet's achievement had already begun transcending the immediate circumstances of her crime and entering the realm of legend among those who understood what she had really accomplished. The enslaved communities throughout Louisiana whispered her name with a mixture of fear and admiration, recognizing that she had done something that seemed impossible. She had turned the master's own systems of control against him and achieved perfect revenge through perfect service. Her story would be passed down through generations, not as a cautionary tale but as proof that even the most powerless could find ways to reclaim their agency and demand justice from those who thought themselves untouchable. On the morning of her execution, Violet walked to the gallows with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her final meal service, showing no fear or regret for actions that had cost 13 lives and sealed her own fate. The crowd that gathered to witness her death included many who had known the Beauregard family personally and expected to see a broken woman begging for mercy or divine forgiveness. Instead, they encountered someone whose serenity in the face of death suggested a profound peace with her choices and their consequences. When offered the opportunity to make a final statement, Violet's words were recorded by a newspaper reporter who had attended expecting to document the final chapter of a sensational crime story, but instead witnessed something that transcended simple criminal justice. "I cooked for them every day for more than 10 years, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "I knew exactly what they liked, exactly how they wanted, and had it prepared. exactly what would satisfy them completely. That last Sunday, I gave them exactly what they deserved, prepared exactly the way they had taught me to prepare it. I have no regrets except that I couldn't taste it with them. The execution proceeded without incident, but Violet's final words continued resonating long after her body had been cut down and buried in an unmarked grave outside the city limits. Her statement had revealed the deeper meaning of her crime, transforming it from simple murder into something approaching performance art, a final demonstration of skill and service that inverted every assumption about power and control that had governed the relationship between enslaver and enslaved. In the weeks and months that followed, other families throughout the South began experiencing mysterious illnesses during their meals, though none achieved the perfect synchronization and total success that had characterized Violet's masterpiece. Whether these incidents represented inspired copycat crimes or simple coincidence was never determined, but the effect was to create an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that fundamentally altered the relationship between plantation families and their kitchen staff. The Beauregard mansion stood empty for over a year after the massacre, its reputation so thoroughly tainted that no family would consider purchasing it despite the significant reduction in its asking price. Local residents reported strange sounds emanating from the property at night, the clatter of dishes, and the scraping of chairs that suggested ghostly dinner parties continuing in the abandoned dining room. Whether these phenomena were real or imaginary mattered less than their effect on the community's collective psychology. The way Violet's story had infected the consciousness of New Orleans society, like a slow-acting poison that continued working long after its initial administration. The mansion's kitchen became a particular source of fascination and dread, with trespassers reporting the lingering aromas of elaborate meals and the sensation of being watched by invisible eyes that tracked their movements with the intensity of someone calculating exact measurements and timing. When the property was finally sold in 1849 to a family from Boston who were unaware of its history, the new owners lasted less than 6 months before abandoning it after their own cook, a free woman of color, reported that the kitchen seemed to resist her efforts to prepare meals properly, as if some invisible presence were interfering with her work. The house changed hands several more times over the following decades, with each new family discovering that their kitchen staff were either unable or unwilling to prepare meals that met acceptable standards, as if Violet's spirit had claimed permanent dominion over the space where she had achieved her greatest triumph. By the 1880s, the mansion had been converted into a boarding house for traveling merchants, its elegant dining room subdivided into smaller spaces that could accommodate individual lodgers rather than family gatherings. The original kitchen was sealed and abandoned, with meals prepared in a new facility that had been constructed in what had once been the carriage house, as far as possible from the scene of Violet's final performance. Local folklore insisted that the sealed kitchen still contained the ghost of the murdered cook, eternally preparing her masterpiece meal for family members who would never again be hungry. The true genius of Violet's revenge lay not in its immediate effects, but in its lasting psychological impact on the institution of slavery itself. Her story demonstrated that the people held in bondage possessed not only the capability, but the knowledge necessary to turn their master's own systems of control into instruments of destruction. The realization that every meal could potentially be a last meal, that every display of culinary skill might mask deadly intent, fundamentally altered the relationship between enslaver and enslaved throughout the South. Plantation families began employing food tasters, hiring multiple cooks to prepare the same dishes independently, and instituting elaborate security measures that revealed their growing awareness that their survival depended on the goodwill of people they had systematically brutalized. The psychological warfare that Violet had initiated with her final meal service continued long after her death, creating an atmosphere of perpetual suspicion and fear that undermined the confidence and sense of security that slavery had always required to function effectively. Kitchen staff throughout the region found themselves subject to increased surveillance and restrictions, but also discovered that their potential for resistance had gained new recognition and respect from those who sought to control them. The knowledge that someone like Violet could exist, could plan so carefully and execute so perfectly, forced enslaving families to confront the reality that they were surrounded by people whose intelligence and capabilities they had criminally underestimated. This recognition did not lead to improved treatment or the abandonment of slavery, but it did create cracks in the psychological foundation that allowed the system to function with such apparent stability. The fear that any cook might be the next Violet, that any meal might be prepared with deadly intent, introduced an element of uncertainty and vulnerability into lives that had been built on assumptions of absolute control and inherent superiority. Her legacy lived on not only in the whispered stories passed down through enslaved communities, but in the nervous glances that white families exchanged when their food seemed to taste different than expected, in the way they began paying closer attention to the people who prepared their meals and cleaned their houses, and knew this routines with intimate precision. Dr. Thibodeau's private journals, discovered decades after his death, revealed that he had suspected the truth about the Beauregard massacre from the beginning, but had chosen to remain silent, rather than risk the social and professional consequences of publicly crediting an enslaved woman with such sophisticated planning and execution. His detailed analysis of the poisoning methods demonstrated a grudging respect for Violet's knowledge and skill, noting that her understanding of botanical toxicology surpassed that of many trained physicians, and that her ability to calculate dosages and timing revealed intellectual capabilities that challenged every assumption about racial inferiority that supported the institution of slavery. The doctor's reluctance to share these observations reflected the broader unwillingness of educated professionals to acknowledge evidence that contradicted the racial theories used to justify human bondage. But his private admiration for Violet's achievement suggested that at least some members of the white elite understood exactly what they were dealing with when they claimed ownership over human beings. His journals also revealed that several other families had consulted him about mysterious illnesses affecting their households in the years following Violet's execution, incidents that he suspected but could not prove were inspired by her example. The pattern of symptoms in these cases showed less sophistication than Violet's masterpiece, but demonstrated that her knowledge was being transmitted through the enslaved community and adapted for use against other oppressive families. Dr. Thibodeau's growing paranoia about his own household staff led him to make increasingly detailed notes about his daily meals and their effects on his health, a practice that revealed both his professional fascination with Violet's methods and his personal terror at the possibility that he might become the target of similar treatment. His final journal entry, dated just days before his death from what appeared to be natural causes in 1852, expressed his belief that Violet's true legacy was not the specific crime she had committed, but the psychological transformation she had achieved among both enslaved and enslaving populations. She had proven that power was more fragile than anyone had imagined, that knowledge could be more dangerous than physical force, and that justice could be served by those who society deemed incapable of complex thought or sophisticated planning. Today, over 175 years after Violet served her final meal to the Beauregard family, her story remains one of the most carefully suppressed chapters in American history, buried beneath layers of shame, fear, and deliberate forgetting that reveal how thoroughly her actions challenged the foundational myths of a society built on human exploitation. The official records still list the family's deaths as resulting from unknown fever, while the true story has been relegated to whispered folklore and academic footnotes that fail to capture the full significance of what she accomplished. But for those who understand the deeper currents of power and resistance that have always flowed beneath the surface of American society, Violet's legacy represents something far more profound than simple revenge or criminal violence. She demonstrated that the most effective resistance often comes not from dramatic gestures or violent rebellion, but from the patient application of knowledge and skill by people who have been systematically underestimated by their oppressors. Her story reveals that power structures based on dehumanization contain the seeds of their own destruction, that those who claim superiority over others inevitably become dependent on the very people they seek to control. The psychological impact of her actions extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect an entire system of oppression, introducing elements of fear, and uncertainty that undermined the confidence necessary for effective domination. In our current era, when new forms of control and manipulation are being deployed against populations deemed expendable by those in power, Violet's example offers crucial lessons about the potential for resistance hidden within apparent submission and the ways that traditional knowledge can be weaponized against modern systems of exploitation. Her story reminds us that the people who prepare our food, clean our spaces, and know our daily routines possess intimate knowledge that could be turned against us if we push them beyond their breaking point. Most importantly, she proved that justice can be served by those who society considers powerless, that perfect revenge requires perfect patience, and that the most dangerous enemies are often those we never see coming. The cook always remembers, and the cook is always watching, always learning, always preparing for the moment when service becomes something else entirely.